Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone is having a lovely, lovely day. We are about to start Lecture 3 on Canada and World War II. And on this particular lecture, we are going to we are going to wrap up the ties that we talked about last time, which were the Canadian military involvement in World War II. And I'm going to do that by asking you to read page 116, which shows you a movement of Canadian troops in the Netherlands, and a short paragraph that will wrap up what we were talking about last time with regards to the military, Canada, and their participation in World War II. Before we begin, I'm going to share with you Mackenzie King, Prime Minister Mackenzie King of Canada, his announcement that Canadian troops are participating in World War II. Now, this is a primary source. It comes from the time period. So it is actually entitled CBC D-Day Live, Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King. And this is from the CBC News, The National. So please listen.
We take you now to Ottawa. The Prime Minister of Canada, the Right Honourable W.W.I. Mackenzie King.
At 3:30 this morning, the government received official word that the invasion of Western Europe had begun. Word was also received that the Canadian troops were among the Allied forces who landed this morning on the northern coast of France. Canada will be proud to learn that our troops are being supported by units of the Royal Canadian Navy and the Royal Canadian Air Force. The great landing in Western Europe is the opening of what we hope and believe will be the decisive phase of the war against Germany. The fighting is certain to be heavy, bitter, and costly. We must not expect early results. We should be prepared for local reverses as well as successes. No one can say how long this phase of the war may last. But we have every reason for confidence in the final outcome. I cannot better express to the people of Canada the government's feelings at this moment than by giving to you the words of General Crerar, the Canadian Army Commander, as conveyed to the Canadian Assault Forces on the eve of their embarkation. I have, said General Crerar, complete confidence in our ability to meet the tests which lie ahead.
So again, that was Prime Minister Mackenzie King talking about Canadian troop participation in the D-Day invasion. And once again, I ask that you please go ahead and read page 116 in your text, which talks about Canadian troops in the Netherlands, which will wrap up our previous lecture on Canada and participation of the military during World War II. Today, we are moving on to the second section of this particular portion on Canada, which talks about Canada's diplomatic role in the Second World War. If you will take a minute and get your graphic organizer ready and find the section where you write down the daily objective. Today's objective is different in that owls will be able to understand and explain Canada's diplomatic role in the Second World War. Objective, once again, is owls will be able to explain and understand Canada's diplomatic role in the Second World War. So instead of focusing on the military, in this lecture we are focusing on Canada's diplomatic role. Interestingly enough, we've already sort of discussed this in that we talked about the Quebec conferences that Churchill and also Roosevelt participated in. We did not mention, however, that Mackenzie King was a part of these conversations and these developing diplomatic relationships throughout World War II. But he took sort of he was sort of behind the scenes in these diplomatic negotiations. But all throughout the Quebec conferences, Mackenzie King was present, albeit the focus and emphasis was on Churchill and Roosevelt, while Mackenzie King was a sort of player still, I would argue, but the emphasis and focus still was on Churchill and Roosevelt. Now, throughout the entire time World War II unfolds, Canada is going to have diplomatic relations with varying countries. The United States, for example, the United Kingdom, France, and of course the USSR are going to be our main focus in this lecture. So let's talk a little bit about Canada's relations with France. As you know from previous lectures in the course, especially during World War I, Canada is divisive in that she has a population that is French speaking. Their ties have always been linguistically and culturally bound to France. The main focal area of French speaking Canadians has been Quebec. And during this time period, we're going to investigate some of the issues that arise because of that. In the same vein, and talking about divisiveness, not only do we have French-speaking Canadians, but we also have Canadians who are very loyal to Britain, right? They're English-speaking. Their ties are deep into Britain. Their history is intertwined with Britain, and they do not understand the French-speaking alliances with France, the French-speaking Canadians' alliances with France, and adherence to the French culture, which in many instances also includes Catholicism, as we talked about last time. So as the war unfolds, World War II unfolds in Canada, it causes divisiveness because there are many French-speaking Canadians who are not necessarily for a war that supports Britain, almost in their minds exclusively, right? In fact, many were very concerned about supporting the United Kingdom financially and materially during this war. And those who were sort of against supporting the United Kingdom financially and materially were, in many instances, those Canadians who were French-speaking and held an alliance to France. Now, the problem gets even deeper in Canada as the war progresses because, as you'll remember, France actually falls to the Nazis in 1940. And then we see the rise of the, quote, Vichy Government, which is based in central and southern France. In fact, the French Channel and Atlantic coast were controlled by the Germans. The leader of the Vichy Government was Marshal Pétain, whose beliefs, work, family, and country strongly appeal to the right-wing French Canadians in Quebec. So not only do we have those ties historically entrenched, those French ties entrenched in Canadian society, they get even more prominent when France falls and the Free Government moves to Britain, and France, in fact, has a government set up by the Nazis under Pétain, who we refer to as the Vichy regime. Now, these very rightist viewpoints appeal to many French Canadians, causing further divisions in France, especially those who were English-speaking and held ties to Britain and who wanted to support Britain financially and economically during the war. Now, as the war goes on, as I mentioned before, we do have a free government for France set up in the United Kingdom under Charles de Gaulle. And de Gaulle is going to attempt to not only negotiate on behalf of Free France, but negotiate with Canada on behalf of Free France. In fact, for the most part of the war, Mackenzie King dealt with both de Gaulle and Pétain, but eventually ended relations with Pétain. The leading Canadian politicians disliked Pétain's right-wing views and acceptance of Nazi control. Moreover, when Canada was in the midst of the Conscription Crisis, the Vichy government recommended that French Canadians retain volunteerism. This created further problems in an already divisive and distraught society, which we have talked about in Canada. In fact, what made the situation even worse was that the many French language newspapers in Quebec were constantly pouring out different propaganda, especially from Vichy. They were openly anti-war, anti-British, and at the same time anti-Semitic. So this increases further divides and issues not only for Canada, but for diplomatic relationships between Canada and also France. Eventually, these become more solidified when Mackenzie King, the relationships become more solidified between Canada, France, and Britain when Mackenzie King meets with de Gaulle in Ottawa in June of 1944. De Gaulle is going to secure promises of aid from Canada for the future rebuilding of France. At this point, historians argue that this seems to cement the idea that there would be no more dealings with Vichy and that Vichy is out the window. However, that still caused problems internally for Canada because remember, there are a number of French-speaking Canadians who held the same beliefs and values as the Vichy regime in France. So that's going to still be a growing problem within the Canadian government and I don't want to say government, but within Canada at the time. And we will continue to explore what happens with the United Kingdom. So I mentioned Canada's conscription crisis. During this time period, there was a great fear that many Canadians would be forced to fight in this war, even if they did not want to. There was a fear that conscription would be implemented. In 1939, I believe it's under Mackenzie King, he promises essentially that, look, we're not going to do conscription per se. We'll do conscription this way. If it does happen, it will be under the NRMA. The NRMA stands for the National Resources Mobilization Act. The act, Mackenzie argued, meant that the government could requisition property and conscript Canadians for home defense. However, it would not necessarily mean that these persons who were conscripted would have to fight overseas. This was sort of the promise made in 1939 to Canadians by Mackenzie King. However, as the war goes on, Mackenzie King actually has to hold a plebiscite. And the plebiscite happens in 1942. And in this plebiscite, it's basically asking the citizens of Canada to revisit the issue of conscription once again and to basically vote whether or not conscription can be introduced into Canadian society. During this time period, the cultural divide is very obvious as the plebiscite takes place. The numbers showed that English-speaking Canadians were in favor of conscription at 80%, but the French Canadians in Quebec, for example, were 73% against the idea of conscription. In Quebec, there was an antipathy towards conscription which went back to the First World War. With a majority of the country supporting conscription, however, King was able to introduce the bill. So, once again, further issues, cultural issues, and divides are creating problems politically and also militarily. As we can see, even though the overwhelming majority, I don't say the overwhelming majority, but the majority of Canadians wanted to, in fact, vote for conscription, there were a large percentage of French Canadians who did not want conscription and who did not want to be forced to go overseas, in fact, to fight in this war, World War II. The end result is that there was no real need for Canadian reinforcements until after D-Day, in particular D-Day landings, when advances were made into Belgium. So during this time period, there's not a real need until that time for Canadian conscription. However, the Canadian Defense Minister, Colonel Ralston, visited Canada's forces and informed King that conscripted troops should be sent immediately. King was unsure what to do and he dismissed Ralston. McNaughton, Ralston's successor, suggested that those serving under the NRMA could volunteer for overseas service, but the end result is that insufficient NRMA personnel would come forward. Some of the ministers favoring conscription in King's cabinet threatened to resign, forcing the Prime Minister's hand. King then agreed to send conscripts, and about 13,000 men, mostly NRMA, were sent to Europe. However, only about 2,500 of the conscripts saw frontline action, and about 75 were killed. So the issue of conscription, even though voted upon, was still weighing heavily culturally within Canadian society, even to the point where Mackenzie King was very hesitant to involve the idea of conscription and to move forward with it, even though holding a plebiscite, they agreed that it could happen. So we know a little bit about the conscription. Let's talk very quickly and about the relations with France. How are the relations with the United Kingdom? Obviously, Canada held very tight links with the United Kingdom, and they remained so throughout the duration of the war. Canada, in fact, supplied the UK with important material and war goods to the tune of approximately $2.5 billion. Now, the United Kingdom could not afford to pay all of this at once. Loans were extended, interest-free, by Canada to the United Kingdom for the war effort to the sum of $700 million. Many people were very upset by this because they felt that these loans could have been better used in building up Canada. And again, this shows the cultural divide within Canada at the time. Now, relations with the USA were well, and they continue to evolve in a very profitable manner, I would argue, for both the United States and for Canada. President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Mackenzie King met several times. They met in 1940, for example, in New York to issue the Ogdensburg Agreement, which established permanent joint board on defense. The two leaders said that the board, comprising both Canadian and American military and civilian representatives, would consider the defense of the northern half of the Western Hemisphere. So very early on, Canada and the United States were meeting to basically look at defending, should they be invaded by the Nazis, how they could collectively bring their heads together and their military together to, in fact, provide defense for North America. We will continue on with the USA and Canada, and then with the USSR tomorrow. I want to keep it right at 18 minutes, and we will wrap up there tomorrow. I hope you guys have a great day, and I will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.